I'm very glad that you're all here. My name is Rosemary Malfi. I am the Pollinator Network Coordinator at NOFA-Mass. You are attending Solar Arrays for Pollinators and Farmers, Opportunities and Constraints. Before I jump in and introduce our speakers, I'm just going to review a few things with you. The first is to share with you that NOFA-Mass is strengthening our commitment to racial equity and justice by examining whiteness and dismantling systems of white supremacy that are part of many dominant systems, including our agriculture and food systems. We also want to honor the indigenous land stewards who are the original occupants of the land on which we are currently living, farming, and residing. You can see a link at the bottom of this screen. Please use this link to find the area where you live and to identify the original stewards of those lands. And we'll be dropping that link into the chat for you as well.
The link, all the links will be dropped into the chat and it's currently there.
Excellent, thank you, Fern. We also want to call everyone to action on a few items to assist BIPOC-led organizations. Those actions are listed on the slides. I'll just sort of pause for a beat so you can read that on the right. And I also want to let you know that there are 2 events taking place for Spanish speakers and for BIPOC members during the conference. And you can see the details for those events on the screen. They're also listed in the program. I think we're all pretty familiar with Zoom norms by now, but I will go over them anyway. We will make, of course, every effort to get to your questions. The way that this is going to work during this session is we're going to save all of the questions until the end after the presenters have presented. But at any time, you can drop your question into the chat, and myself and my co-host Fern will be checking the chat, and at the end of the session, we will revisit those questions. So feel free to just sort of drop the questions in as they occur to you. This account, of course, is set to mute participants upon entry. If there's a reasonable enough participants during the Q&A for you to unmute yourself, the way that you do that to ask your question is to just press the microphone button at the bottom of the screen. And then we ask that you please mute yourself when you're done speaking to avoid creating background noise while other people are talking. And we also, of course, want to let you know that this session is being recorded. We also want to thank the sponsors who have made our conference possible and encourage you to purchase from them. And when you do, let them know that you are so glad that they support NOFA-Mass. Here's some, and here's some more. We also have an online auction with many really amazing items. So I encourage you to go to the link down there, or you can text NOFA to 855-202-2100 to get a lineup of the items that are on there. And please also take a moment to explore the virtual vendor marketplace, where there is a lot of great information and some generous discount codes for conference attendees. Most importantly, we want to thank you. Thank you for spending the weekend with us, and especially to our NOFA members who make our education and advocacy work possible. At this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to introduce our presenters. And Jesse, I think you're up first, so feel free to start sharing your screen.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so our presenters are Evan Abramson. Evan Abramson is a results-driven designer and planner on a mission to rebuild biologically diverse ecosystems through pollinator-plant interactions. As founder and principal of Landscape Interactions, he works closely with project partners along every step of the process, from conception through design, implementation, and maintenance. Since 2019, Landscape Interactions has been responsible for nearly 200 acres of habitat installed in the Northeast, specifically targeting at-risk bee and butterfly species for each project location. Stephen Herbert is former Associate Dean and Director of the UMass Center for Agriculture, Mass Agricultural Experiment Station, and UMass Extension. He provided leadership to faculty and staff in applied and advanced research and extension for agriculture. Dr. Herbert maintains active research and education programs in crop production, including renewable energy, integrating spaced solar panels with pasture and vegetable crops. And our first speaker, Jesse Robertson Dubois, is a farmer, conservationist, and policy wonk who raises sheep and goats with his family in Northfield, Massachusetts. He embraces the opportunity that sustainable agri-solar farming represents, grazing and conventional solar arrays, and working toward the permitting and construction of 3 dual-use agri-solar arrays at 4-star farms to produce crops, livestock, and energy for local and regional customers. In addition to farming, Jesse has worked for American Farmland Trust and the trustees, and has been a board member of 2 local land trusts. And with that, I turn it over to Jesse.
Great. Thanks so much, Rosemary. We've only got about 20 minutes for each of us. I'm going to try to move fast and come in under that. And I thought, I'm not going to put a lot of time into the policy side of this because it's such a deep dive and I'm not a solar expert. I'm a farmer and a farmland protection policy wonk who started looking at solar both from the agricultural side and the policy side. I thought the most value I can give you guys is sort of some show and tell and some explanation of what we're trying to do. So sorry, I was actually still in Zoom, so can't make it go. So I'm going to try to talk first about solar grazing, what my experience has been, the opportunity I saw, and how it's gone getting into it. A little bit of background about solar policy. All of the grazing and arrays I've done is in arrays built under the prior policy structure, have nothing to do with the current policy structure. So you need to sort of understand the basics of that to understand what we're doing with the dual use arrays in Northfield. And then I'll talk a little bit about what that system design looks like and what our goals are. This is a map of the Commonwealth from Google Earth that I have been building over the past several years as I just play with Google Earth and look for arrays and drive around and find arrays. Those are, to the best of my ability, the actual array acreages of the fences. There is a lot out there, as everybody knows. That's why this is such a hot subject right now. The American Solar Grazing Association, I'm going to put this up front, they are really leading the charge when it comes to grazing in conventional solar arrays. So anybody who has any interest in this, start following them. But a lot of the story for conventional solar in Massachusetts from the landowner's perspective, from the farmer's perspective, starts with a picture something like this. This isn't the family house of the arrays I've been grazing in, but it's around the corner and it's a very similar. Things happen, people die, management changes, farm operations change. This is in an orchard part of the state. This is a house on an old orchard. The arrays I've been grazing in are another old orchard. Back in 2005, you can see all of these were orchard. The current landowner inherited the land, didn't want to continue orcharding. It's a tough business these days. Nobody else was interested in running an orchard. He just needed something to do with the properties. He didn't want to sell it for housing. Some housing obviously had already been sold, but he didn't want to continue going down that road. The outlines that I did there are where the solar arrays show up later on. 2016, you can see the first small array has appeared. From talking with him, his motivation is really about that land. And you can't see it yet, but what he's doing there is by putting a small array in the back of that one field, he actually was able to fund the conversion of the rest of that field into hayfield. Anybody who's ever tried to take an orchard out and restore it to hayfield or pasture or some other use knows how expensive that project is. It wasn't going to happen without the money from that solar array. So 20 years from now, that solar array will be gone and there will be one large field there. What he does with it then, obviously, we don't know. It's going to be his decision at that point, or more likely his kid's decision, because he's fairly old. But we've got an opportunity that we know that the land use there for 20 years looks like this. And then after that, we don't have a second growth forest growing up through orchards that's not good for much of anything. We've got an opportunity to really keep it in agricultural use at that point. Also in 2019, you can see over in the big array, which I call the small array hayfield and I call the big array hilltop. Those are just my names, but that's how I think about it. In the hilltop array, the big one, you can see that the orchard has come out and the solar arrays are starting to be built in 2019. This one was one of the early arrays built under the current policy structure. The small array was built under the prior policy structure. Both of these are conventional arrays. The ground clearance at the lower edge of the panels is roughly 3 to 4 feet. Dense array spacing, not built or intended from a policy perspective, from anybody's perspective other than the landowners, to be dual use agricultural and solar. But the landowner had it as a goal that he would love to see somebody graze in there, or at the very least, have an interest in, trying to move in that direction, which is why I was able to make a connection with the solar array owners. Like almost all solar development, these properties are leased from the landowner by the solar company, who has full control of the properties. He can't get in the gate if he, unless they invite him in the gate. The solar array owners, the asset owners, are a large multinational corporation, as most of these are, and that's just a fact of the tax incentive structure for these arrays. If you want to build things at a megawatt scale, you're not talking about something that we're going to do. You're talking about something that companies are going to do. You're looking at these days well over $300,000 per acre of investment to get these things built. So on the large array, this is what I was doing this past year. Those are my sheep. The hilltop array is the one on the left. The hayfield array is the one on the right. What I was really attracted about with these sites is, since both of them had been old orchard, the underlying vegetation was still a mix of orchard grasses and clovers and the other things you would expect to see. When they did the development, they did, they didn't do like a whole scalp and reset the soil profile. They took out the trees, they ground the stumps out. They did a little more work than that, obviously, but to the extent they could. And I don't think they were doing this out of a, desire to necessarily, but, they didn't want to spend money they didn't have to spend, and where there was existing vegetation, they didn't mess with it because it was easier and cheaper that way. But for me, it meant that I was coming into actually fairly good, fairly diverse potential forage. And it's very diverse, particularly in the hilltop array. Inside the small array, I don't manage the hayfield. He has another neighboring farmer that manages the hayfield outside the array. He has some livestock of his own, so he's trading for hay that way. But I'm actually able to make hay inside that array. This is obviously running alongside the perimeter inside the fence, but I actually am able to, with my equipment, which is walk behind Italian BCS and Cave equipment, I'm able to make hay even right along underneath the panels. If you look down on the bottom left, if it's not behind your gallery, you can see my mower. It's a 6-foot wide sickle mower. I can cut right underneath the panels and then rake it out from under the panels to make hay. I'm sorry I don't have a baling picture from the array. I was really rushing to beat rain this year, and I didn't stop for pictures once I was baling, but that's a picture from another site. In the hilltop array, this is the kind of forage diversity I have at the ground level, and I included the monarchs because the biological diversity of vertebrates and invertebrates is really incredible too. The other thing about these arrays is the fences here go to the ground. Coyotes are not getting into these arrays, which obviously I like for sheep. But what that also means is it's a safe place for wildlife. And they are really full of birds and insects, small mammals, amphibians, snakes. I mean, you name it, I've seen it in here. We've seen, my wife, who's a birder, identified savanna sparrows in there and a ton of other stuff. I'm not a birder, but I think it's so cool to watch them working in there. The photo on the left there shows post-grazing after I clipped along the leading edge of the panels to make sure there's no shading. But you can see, I've grazed, it's starting to come back. You've got dead senescent grass over on the right-hand edge there. And I was able to do 2 passes over the whole array, even though I was starting in late June before I was able to get in there. We'll talk a little bit about the late start date. The catch, so contracts, bidding, big corporations, insurance requirements, safety protocols. If you're grazing in an array, you are working inside an electrical generation station. That's what you're doing. Hard hats, jackets, high visibility jackets, all of that stuff. The bidding process, I haven't had a lot of trouble with. It takes time to do a contract with a big company. They have protocols they have to follow. Don't bother trying to change them. You won't. Insurance requirements are insane. I'm carrying a $4 million policy. It's insane for me as a guy with sheep and a truck and trailer. It's not insane for the owner of a multi-million-dollar asset that can be damaged by somebody driving into it. It's just part of the landscape. You got to accept it if you want to work in there. Remote sites, if you've never done remote grazing off your farm, think hard before you get into doing remote grazing off your farm. It's a different thing. It's very doable. I've been doing it for years, so it was an easy fit for me. The arrays I'm grazing in are the exception rather than the rule. They're not a 5% exception, but they're probably a 20% exception in terms of the forage that's on the ground there. Mostly a solar mix is going to be creeping fescue. It's not very productive. It's not very palatable. It's not great forage. One of the big challenges I see is being able to reseed arrays that are already in operation, figuring out how to do that well. With a lot of underground conduit and multi-million-dollar investments, the solar companies are not going to be eager for us to go in there even with a no-till drill. Forget about full tillage. So figuring out good reseeding strategies for the existing landscape of several thousand acres of arrays is an enormous area for all of us to work on if we want to keep doing this. And then the final thing is you're responsible for cleaning up the vegetation. There are some companies that will do a grazing only contract. I wouldn't bother with it. You're not going to, the contract rates for that are not going to be much. For comprehensive vegetation management in Massachusetts, you're talking about several $100s an acre that you can get paid as a farmer to maintain the vegetation in that array to the standard of the company. But you've got to be able to mow around the perimeter fence. You've got to be able to mow the driveway on the way in, around those stupid bushes, all the rest of that stuff. It's just part of the landscape, but for several $100 an acre, it makes the drive time and the extra work worth it to get pasture that's got a fence built already for you and shade for those hot days in July and August. So what's wrong with the arrays? From the drive-by, everybody hates them. I hate them. They're ugly. You got these big fences. That's an electrical code thing. We can do agricultural fencing, but big companies don't change without being pushed. You've got a lot of big gravel roads going in. Again, electrical code. The utilities and the fire department need to get in there with equipment. Those poles you see out front, why does every single array have 3 poles outside of it? Because the utility company requires that. You want to connect to the grid, you need to put up 3 poles. I would love to change that, but we're not going to change that without a lot more push. And then the squiggly line, the squiggly line there in the bottom is supposed to be the forage underneath, the creeping fescue. We're making good progress with that. Frankly, anything that Evan's going to put down for pollinator habitat, I'd love to graze too. I'm not so worried about what's planted in the arrays as long as it's something sheep can eat and it's productive. And then you have the sort of stupid arborvitaes along the fence line to visually screen the array, which I don't know why Concoms and planning boards continue to require them. They don't work. They don't screen the arrays. They're still ugly. I wish we could fix the fence problems. That would go a long way. Other things you're going to look at. So bottom left there, that's a picture of me mowing around the outside of this array. They're going to build the fence and they're going to build the array to the limits of what they can fit because scale matters in solar construction just as much or more than it does in farming. So the outside of the array is going to be tough ground to mow. The little combiner panel up there in the top left, that's showing where somebody screwed up with the construction. They obviously have water leaking into that run of conduit and it's coming out of that combiner panel there. Not anything that I have any responsibility for, but it's the thing I watch for when I'm looking at an array, because if I'm sort of doing a bidding process and I see a lot of problems like that, I think harder about what other problems I don't notice that I'm going to find later on that could impact what I'm doing. Other things you see is wiring that comes loose. They run ground wires from one set of panels to the next, the whole length of each rack. If those come loose, you have more potential for electrical hazards, that kind of thing. The big picture in the middle is a large array in Western Mass, just finished construction last year, just seeded. Again, conventional, not done with anything in mind, but this I view as an ideal opportunity for grazing in, because if you look at it, it's really rough territory. It's really rough ground. It's going to be crazy expensive for somebody to mow that. I would be, and since the seeding obviously didn't take that well, it's all creeping fescue, it's crap for forage, but it didn't take very well. And that creates an opportunity for me to get in there and start putting down orchard grass and white clover seed and improving it the way I want, using sheep to be able to move fertility around the site. The reason a farmer is able to make several $100 an acre for managing vegetation is because mowing is not the costly part of managing vegetation in an array. It's the weed whack. Other things to look for on the left, there's mountain laurel. That's actually outside of the array, but there was a little more inside. I didn't take that one. I don't want to kill my sheep. Again, rocks and stump sprouts all around the outside perimeter of most of these arrays where they've cut back the woods. You really need to think hard about the mowing. And then on the right, you can see there's a little bit of erosion control and landscape fabric outside the array there. That's pretty typical. I don't think local boards are doing a good job of following up to make sure that, you know, all of that stuff gets taken out. Is it a huge environmental problem long term? No, it's just a pain for whoever's going to mow. So be looking for that. But how do we do it better? That's a policy question. That's not a we're going to change what the solar companies do. The solar companies are in a race to get these things initialized. The way the incentives work in Massachusetts, the first people to get in the door make more money off of their arrays than the later people. And most of the solar companies that do construction or development are not the long-term asset owners. That's because of federal tax policy. We can complain about it, but I can't change it. And I don't know that any of us will be able to change it very soon. The way this works is big money from big banks. These are Goldman Sachs scale investment portfolio assets for the companies that are buying them. We can complain about that, but that's the way it is until we change both state and federal law at a very large scale. So, crash course. I'm not going to go through all of this, but distance to the grid is the #1 factor in where these things get built. In terms of scale, we're talking 17,000 megawatts for all household usage in Massachusetts and 40,000 megawatts for solar capacity to be installed to cover all of our electrical use. We're currently at a little over 2,000 megawatts. The SMART program, which is the current program, is intended to be 3,200 megawatts. So best case scenario, over the next several years, we get to maybe 10 or 15% of Massachusetts electrical use. When we talk about we should do small arrays instead of big arrays, as a farmer, I say, I don't want to mess with small arrays. And as a person who cares about where our electricity comes from, you're kidding yourselves. We're not going to be able to get there. The way the SMART program is designed, again, I said it's a competitive race for companies to get things built. There are pretty good, actually, requirements in there to push for smaller arrays, which again, I think that's a mixed bag, but most forested habitat is off limits, except for ag land that is an agricultural project or public entity projects. A town is sponsoring the project, or small projects. All conserved land, all wetlands, completely off limits. The way it works is they provide a bunch of different incentives at different kilowatt hour rates to the eventual asset owner for doing various things that are good or taking off a little bit of money if it's a large parcel on a greenfield being a previously undeveloped parcel. The reason you're hearing a lot about agrivoltaic now, aside from the fact that it's awesome and farmers are interested in it, is also that it has the ability to be one of the largest adders you can get at 6 cents per kilowatt hour. That is the intention there is to pay for the extra cost of lifting the panels up, spacing them out, incurring larger fencing and land acquisition costs, having a larger fence, all of those kinds of things. It basically is the extra cost of making the array itself farmable, both for grazing and for crops. All in, the range you're looking at is somewhere between around 40 cents a kilowatt hour to 15 cents a kilowatt hour for a small residential system. And on the biggest, largest agrivoltaic system you could do, you're looking at the most you're ever going to make is around 25 cents down to around 6 cents for a large ground mount, non-agrivoltaic, no adders in there. So when we talk about the incentives and people say we should be encouraging rooftop, we are encouraging rooftop very heavily. It's a lot more expensive to build. Here's what we're planning to do in Northfield. This is the yellow is the 3 arrays we're looking at. And I know I'm almost done, so I'm gonna go really fast. We're looking at 40 acres, 26 acres for the 2 agricultural ones. We're getting fencing, we're getting new barns, and we're getting a new road system to be able to get through some very muddy, low-lying patches in the back center of the farm. The 6-acre array is going to be a conventional array. I still consider it agricultural because I'm going to be farming. This is what we're doing. 10-foot clearance when their panels are horizontal, north-south arrays that are on tilting trackers. I put that sickle mower in there. That's a Heston 8200 that I scaled to match. I couldn't get the engineer to put one in the plans originally, but that's what I plan to harvest forage with in addition to sheep. That's a conventional mid-90s sickle bar mower conditioner. You can still buy them around $10,000. Can't buy anything like that new. It's a 12-foot wide mower head on that. Can't buy anything new, but what I love about it is I have 2 passes, up, back, and then I have 2 windrows centered towards the center of the array a little bit. And I run through with a tedder, I run through with a rake, I run through the round baler, and I'm done. It's gonna be a great system to make hay in. How much dry hay versus how much baleage I'll be able to make, I don't know. And honestly, I don't really care. I like baleage, works out fine for me. Those 3 projects are gonna do 10.5 megawatts, cost estimate around $238 for the watt per cost installed. Smart incentive would be around 16 cents a kilowatt. Everything else that's been installed in the town of Northfield since 2018 comes out to a total of 182 kilowatts, average cost of $4.11 per watt, and a smart incentive of around 25 cents. So my point with this is just to say, we're making 50 times the electricity, still farming the land, and it's less than 2/3 of the cost. It's more like in the 50, low 60s in terms of percentage of the cost of both either the install cost or the incentive. The other thing we get out of that is we get a family farm. That's us. We're going to be there for the rest of our working lives, probably the rest of our lives, period. That's my presentation.
Thank you, Jesse. I imagine folks may have questions. Again, you can just drop them in the chat and then we'll get to them at the end of all the presentations. Dr. Stephen Herbert, you are next, I believe. Excellent. Oh, and you're muted, Stephen.
And start sharing again. And there we go. Okay, I'm going to be talking about both pasture and vegetables under solar. This was a project I started building in 2010, and I'll show you a picture of what we have. These are solar panels on poles. The lower part of the panel is about 7.5 feet off the ground and goes up in 3 panel clusters, which are mounted on a cross beam that's mounted on top of the poles. The poles go in the ground about 8 feet, and this was done with Hyperion Corporation back in 2010. So this describes that, and we have spaces between the panel clusters that vary from 2 feet to 5 feet, and this was to allow an evaluation of how much light we needed to get through to get pretty good yields of the crops that were growing under the panels. At the time, putting poles in the ground were dig a hole and fill it with concrete around the pole. This was done a non-invasive system where we forced the poles into the ground. They use a vibrating system now. So the first slide I'll show is of the pasture work. We were grazing cattle underneath the panels, and the cattle really enjoyed grazing under there. On hot days, they would lie down in the shade of the panels. When they were itchy, they would rub up against the panel, and these were very sturdy, and if you drove into them with a a tractor or any other equipment, you would damage the tractor, not the poles. They were 8-inch poles at the time. They are now 4-inch poles that are used, which may bend a little more than the 8-inch. What I want to show you in this slide is that as long as we have more than 4 feet of space between the panels, we could get back to about 90% of the pasture yield compared to the no panel control. And so using solar panels to generate electricity in a pasture is a really good system to add to the viability of a farm. And I'll tell you why that works as we go down a little bit further. After moving away from pasture, I got funding from NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab, and they wanted to look at growing vegetables because this was the only research site at this time that did this type of research looking at allowing light to come through between panel clusters. At that time, we grew our crops, which were broccoli, Swiss chard, kale, and pepper, underneath the panels going across the array in this manner. And I don't know whether you can see my mouse, but there's out the front here, there are control plants which were planted as well. The other thing that we did, we had trickle irrigation going under the length of the field, and that was important, especially in 2016, which, if you remember back then, was a very dry year. So we planted these by hand at this time. I like the idea that of the arrays being 10 feet off the ground. I came up with a design of that, and I could share a little bit. If you wanted to stabilize them, you could put an angle iron from one row to the next row to stabilize everything as well. But anyway, we're planting these under the thing. This is a yield of kale, fresh kale weight in 2016. You can see as we got it to 3 feet gap, 4 feet and 5 foot gap, we virtually got the same yield as we did with no panels. And there was no difference between the panels yields compared to the no panel yield. 2016 was a very dry year. Remember, I had trickle under irrigation under there, so it wasn't the irrigation effect, it was more the heat and light effect. In 2017, or the other thing is, we're about just under 400 grams per plant, or grams per unit, yeah, grams per plant, in all of these 3 foot through no panel. In 2017, we still kept about 400 grams per plant in the plants growing under panels, but being a much cooler, a more average year, the no panel system was much higher in yield. So you do have a cost to putting panels across a field and growing vegetables underneath them. So that was for kale. The same sort of thing for Swiss chard. Swiss chard was higher yields in 2016 than the no panel control. I'm going to go back a little because I forgot to, in 2017, it wasn't as high. I'm going to go back a couple here and just show you. I forgot to mention it. You see the narrow gaps and the wide gaps. You can also see that this shade panel is on an angle and this one is not. At noon, the shade is directly behind the panels. In the morning, the sun from the east, the shade is out to the west. In the afternoon, the shade is out to the east. And so the yield that you get from under panels and between panel clusters works out to virtually the same because of this moving light pattern that happens throughout the day. The shade affecting plants directly under the panel those are not always in the shade. They always get some light because of the movement of the sun, of the earth in relation to the sun, our apparent moving of the shade pattern. So let me come back here. I'll finish very soon actually to catch up some time for more time for questions. So initially all the crops in 2016 grew successfully through the drought and heat. The leaf temperature under the panels was 15 degrees cooler, and we've tested this several times on a sunny day, on a clear day, contributing to higher yields of shade versus unshaded panels. So 15 degrees cooler in 2016, a dry, hot year, the plants were able to grow just as well or better than the unshaded, which were experiencing heat stress. More shade does decrease the yield in some crops. We also grew beans, and beans were a higher yield under the shade, and this was probably related to heat stress in mid to late summer when beans were grown as a second crop. Again, we watered daily or almost daily, so moisture was not a problem. In 2017, the weather was cooler and wetter than 16, and so the yields in the controls were higher than the previous year, and most likely all of this was related to less heat stress in 2017. The yields of crops under the partial shade from solar panels in this moderate year was less than it was in 2016. I'm going to show you one more. In 2019, after we had used the other panel, NREL wanted to look at planting from the front of the panels to the back of the panels. So from the front of the panels through to the back of the panels, they wanted to look at that. And if you can look at this pepper row, for instance, the shade pattern changes and the pepper plants got smaller under the middle of the shade and larger out in full sun. And so again, shade is important, but the shade pattern moves, and so crops can survive and can produce, but not as well under the full shade. I'll just show you, this here is this new design going from the front of the panels to the back of the panels. Right underneath the panels, the yield drops down. And the closer the pattern, or then you get higher yield with wider spacing in between. So that's where I'll finish and turn it back to the moderators. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay, Evan, you are up.
All right, thanks, Rosemary, and thank you all. It's really cool to get to follow these two presentations. I'm learning so much about other ways of managing and benefiting from these various projects. My area of interest and of experience is with regards to creating native pollinator habitat on large-scale solar arrays, and that will be what I talk about now. So I'd like to start by just giving a little bit of context. Why is this work relevant right now? We're living in an age that's previously never been experienced on this planet, where humanity's impact on the Earth is so profound that we've created a new geological epoch, which is called the age of the Anthropocene. And essentially, we are driving as many as 30 to 50% of all species on the planet towards extinction, including insects. And insects are essential for ecosystems. And the insect collapse that we're facing right now is essentially a potential collapse of nature, with 1 million species threatened with extinction globally, including more than half of the native bee species in North America. The main reason for this is widely considered to be loss of natural habitat, as well as the use of insecticides. We're also facing a bird crisis. In North America, we've lost 3 billion birds since 1970, which is over 25%. And again, its habitat loss is the most direct cause. So you can see how this is impacting systems, across trophic levels. It's not just insects, it's birds, it's mammals. According to the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity, there's 5 main threats to biodiversity globally, and they are in order of impact. The number one impact is changes in land and sea use. Why do I keep driving home this point? Well, the subject of today's talk is pollinator habitat under solar. And by assigning these large-scale solar arrays to pollinator habitat, we are essentially reversing this ecological collapse that's caused when natural areas, or whether they're forests, fields, gravel and sand pits, are converted to solar. If you don't do something with this land, such as replanting native plant communities for pollinators, that is just further land use driving biodiversity loss. So we are reversing that by putting pollinator habitat on those sites. Climate change is also a major concern, but the scientific community has really spoken about this, and they've stated that biodiversity and climate change are really interconnected. You cannot solve the climate crisis solely by reducing emissions. And you also can't solve the biodiversity crisis solely by protecting at-risk species. You really have to work at them together simultaneously. They're really interconnected, because essentially biodiversity is connected, diverse, and extensive ecosystems. And those ecosystems, the more connected, the more diverse, and the larger that they are, they help stabilize the climate in areas. So it's really both or none. Looking at the impact of conventional farming on native grasslands and meadows, globally, grasslands hold 20% of global carbon stocks, as well as 1/3 of the world's land-based carbon. This is important because we're talking about solar panels as a solution, or part of a solution, to our carbon emission crisis. So what we're doing with that land is also a major impact. And in places like the Midwest United States, they have estimated that tillage for cropland expansion put as much carbon dioxide in the air annually as 31 million cars. So if we just continue with conventional crop agriculture, we are not only screwing ourselves over, we're actually doing more harm than emitting carbon in many, many other ways. And another study found that conserving grasslands in the US could prevent almost 3 times as much carbon emission as conserving forests, which I think is a really interesting topic to consider. Grasslands are also a more reliable carbon sink than trees and forests if you're looking at areas that are prone to wildfire. And that's not only the west of the United States, but it could even be areas on the coast, such as coastal Massachusetts, where we do have a history of fire ecology with many native plants that are fire adapted. And when forests go up in flames, the burned carbon is released back into the atmosphere. Whereas when grasslands, which includes native grasses, sedges, and flowers, and to some extent shrubs, when those go up in flames, the carbon stays underground. Because you look at this root system here. This root system is the perennial system that exists all times of the year, whereas what's above the ground in the case of grasses and flowers and sedges is really dies away in the winter. So really the life is mostly underground. Right here on the left, this is Kentucky bluegrass. It's got an average root depth of about 2 inches. Kentucky bluegrass is your typical long grass, and it's also a common grass found in many farms. Moving over to the right, you have heath aster. That's a native aster. You can see it's got a root depth of about 8 or 9 feet. This over here is switchgrass, another native bunching grass. It's also an important host plant for a lot of at-risk butterflies and moths. And then here on the right is little bluestem, another important host plant and nesting resource for butterflies, moths, and bees. So just wanted to sort of illustrate that in the context of what we're about to consider with regards to solar, since we use a lot of those plants on our solar array designs. Our sort of mantra here at Landscape Interactions is that, farms, conservation lands, solar arrays, suburban, urban communities, and rural communities are really our best opportunities for expanding regional biodiversity, climate resilience, ecological health, and food security. Because what happens at the pollination scale has repercussions all the way up the food web, as you can see from this graphic here, all the way up to humans. Why are pollinators so important? Well, they're primarily insects that fertilize plants, producing seeds and fruit. And they're responsible for assisting over 80% of the world's flowering plants. So without pollinators, over 80% of the flowering plants on Earth would not exist. They would not be able to reproduce. Bees alone pollinate nearly half of the food crops grown in the state of Massachusetts and 1/3 of the food grown in the US. And pollinators are vital and essential to habitats and ecosystems that most animals rely on for food and shelter, including humans. At the same time, some plants are highly specialized. They can only be pollinated by a particular genus or even species of animal. And the same goes for some pollen specialist bees and Lepidoptera. So what you have on the landscape, the diversity of the plant community is really going to drive the diversity of the pollinator community, which then combined is a network which creates biodiversity or lack thereof. Looking at bees specifically, since they're so important for pollination, we've got about 400 native bee species in Massachusetts and the Northeast, which represents over 10% of the native bee species composition of the entire United States. And they do the vast majority of pollination. A global study in 2013 found that looking at 40 different food crops across 600 fields across every populated continent on the planet, wild pollinators were twice as effective as honeybees in producing seeds and fruit. So any argument that we need honeybees to ensure our food security really doesn't stand up when you look at the literature. It's wild pollinators, and especially native wild bees, that are doing the vast majority of pollination. The average range that a native bee forages from their nesting site in the Northeast is only on average between 200 and 1,800 feet. So landscape connectivity and large scale areas are really important to ensure species diversity. 70% of bees nest underground. Most live alone. They're not in social groups. Only bumblebees and honeybees are social for the bees in the Northeast. And other examples of habitat include bare ground, soft pith twigs like you find on elderberry or raspberries or Joe pieweed, abandoned rodent burrows, dead trees, and snags. Those are all opportunities for pollinator nesting. I'm going to go pretty quickly through some of this because our focus is on solar today, but this is just showing you the different average foraging range of different native bees and within proximity to different sites that we worked on in a project in Eastern Massachusetts. So you can see even houses that are on the same street may or may not provide connectivity from one site to the next once you get beyond the larger bees like bumblebees. Looking at our food crops, bombus, which are bumblebees, are the only native bee group that pollinate every major food crop, going from tomato and eggplant to apple, blueberry, and melon. But other native pollinator species also serve their role and are very important. Other significant pollinators, just because it's, depending upon your site, where it's located and what the land use is, you might also be able to attract other groups of pollinators, such as at-risk butterflies like the Aphrodite fritillary. It only lays its eggs on native violets. The monarch butterfly, facing an 81% population decline globally, only lays its eggs on milkweed. And the Dion skipper is an example of one of our wetland butterflies that lays its eggs on sedges. Looking at colony collapse disorder for honeybees, between 1980 and 2005, half the honeybee hives in the US were lost. The major reasons were found to be loss of habitat, pesticides, and climate change. However, since 2005, those populations have really been bouncing back. So honeybees are not at risk. They are not going away, and we don't need to help them. They're stable and even increasing. Whereas wild bee populations in the US went down nearly 25% in just a 5-year period that was measured between 2010 and 2015. And looking here at this next map, this is the estimated use in the US of one type of neonicotinoid pesticide. So you can see that the areas are almost exactly mirrored. The areas with the lowest wild bee abundance are the areas with the highest insecticide or neonicotinoid insecticide use. And thankfully, Mass NOFA has done some great work recently getting limits on the sale of neonicotinoids in Massachusetts to non-professionals, which I applaud. Looking at honeybees versus native bees, here's just a sampling of some of the literature on the subject. The takeaway is really that honeybees outcompete native bees for pollen. And if you put 40 hives out for 3 months, they're collecting the pollen equivalent of 4 million wild bees. They also impact not only bumblebees and solitary bees, but also hoverflies, march flies, other flies, and other flying and flower visiting insects. So where you put honeybee hives makes an impact, and I strongly recommend that honeybee hives remain only on farmland, not on wild ecosystems. What we're essentially advocating for is to go beyond just pollinator friendly and to think about the species that we're attracting to a particular landscape, because plants and animals are so specialized. This is an example of a specialized relationship between a long-tongued bumblebee, Bombus vagans, and a bottle gentian, which is a native wetland flower. And you can see here that only a long-tongued bumblebee can pollinate this flower because only a long-tongued bumblebee is large enough to force its way into the flower and reach the nectar reward at the bottom. So not all bees are built the same, and not all flowers can be pollinated by all bees. And oftentimes what people see on their properties is the same 1 or 2 bee species. So seeing lots of bees is not always a good thing. It might all be honeybees and Bombus impatiens. And in the past 60 years or so, what we've seen across Massachusetts, and this is based on data that's been collected by Dr. Robert Jagir at UMass Dartmouth, is that Bombus impatiens is essentially replacing anywhere from 2 to 7 other bumblebee species in a given part of the state. So they're benefiting from land use change and from climate change. They are a true generalist. They will pollinate anything, including invasives, whereas you have another 10 or 11 bumblebee species that are not necessarily benefiting from all the changes going on in our environment, as well as over 44 butterflies and moths, and 5 more bee species listed by Mass Wildlife as species of greatest conservation concern. So what we advocate for is to create landscapes that include a wide variety of native flowering plants, as well as grasses and sedges and shrubs and what have you, so that we can attract and sustain specifically the species that are at risk, not the species that are common, not the species whose populations are abundant. They don't need our help. Looking at a study that came out just under 2 years ago, researchers found that in northern New England, so they basically looked at northern Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire, we have a 94% loss of plant pollinator networks, which means that we are facing a catastrophe. 94% of interactions between native plant species and native pollinator species are no longer exist. And the efforts that they recommend would be focused specifically on habitat restoration for declining bee and plant species. Again, not species that are common or whose populations are stable. So now let's look at pollinator-friendly work in Massachusetts specifically. In 2020, the DOER launched a pollinator habitat adder for solar projects. As Jesse mentioned, the credit is approximately 25 cents per kilowatt hour, which equals out to $3,500 per megawatt DC per year. It's actually a pretty good incentive, and it's really driving a lot of change in how developers are considering their landscapes. Here on the right, this is an image of one of our project sites right after the arrays were installed. It was a clear-cut forest in the Berkshire Plateau. And the question I have for everyone in the audience is, do we encourage this developer to put in 40 or 50 species of native flowering plants under these arrays and maintain them to the level needed to receive the pollinator adder? Or do we just let this grow back in as a bunch of random weeds, grasses, and invasives? And that this is what we're trying to do. We're educating people to this extent. And the pollinator adder is what makes this possible, because the seeds are not cheap and the maintenance is intensive the first 3 years. Existing and new projects may apply. All projects are required to have a multi-year habitat establishment and maintenance plan, which is what we provide. The sites must be surveyed by a botanist or other ecological professional before the plan is submitted. So seed mixes are not just created in Massachusetts randomly. They're based on the existing conditions of the site, the soils, the hydrology, the proximity to wetlands, the proximity to priority habitat or other ecological features. Also, what's unique about Massachusetts, besides the fact that we're the only state in the country that actually pays developers to be pollinator friendly on their solar arrays, is that 33% of the plants in the seed mixes and in the planting schedule, which includes things like screening species or wetland replications on or adjacent to the site, they have to support pollen specialist bees and or butterflies and or moths of conservation concern. So it's a really directed program. There's some ups and some downs about it. One thing that I've advocated for that has not been implemented yet is, why don't we also target bees of conservation concern? Why are we only targeting pollen specialist bees? Some bees that specialize on the pollen from a particular group of plants are not at risk. They're actually abundant and their populations are stable. Conversely, why are we not including bumblebees? Bumblebees are not pollen specialist bees, but they do have specialized preferences, as we talked about earlier, looking at different bumblebees and which are in decline across the state. But going on, all the plants in these projects have to be vetted as neonicotinoid and pesticide free. That's from either the seed level or the nursery level. They have to be native, not only to the state, but to the county that the project is in. And you cannot use any rare or endemic species if the seed or plant stock is from out of state. And there has to be a comprehensive invasive species management strategy. So it's a lot of hurdles to jump through. And partially for that reason, there's only been 34 solar projects that have been certified as pollinator friendly in Massachusetts to date. Again, the program and the credit have only existed for approximately 22 months. So we're still at the early stages, but right now we've got 34 projects in the state that are certified. It's approximately 600 acres of native pollinator habitat. We at Landscape Interactions have been responsible for getting about a little bit over 3/4 of those projects certified, where we've done 28 so far. And as a whole in the state, 8 solar companies have participated in the pollinator friendly program. The median project size is 2.8 megawatt DC, which is approximately 14 acres, but some are much larger. And just to give some context, pollinator friendly solar in Massachusetts represents less than 7% of the total 2,173 megawatt DC, which have been approved only as part of the SMART program. And there's programs that existed before the SMART program. So it's really just a small amount. Here's an example of one of the plans that we created for one of our client sites. I took off some of the detailed property information, but just so you can see, we start the plan with a description of the existing vegetation. That's done by a botanist that I work with, Adam Cole. This is our site map of existing conditions at the array. So you can see it's within proximity to a bordering vegetated wetland on the southeast. There's forest surrounding the site on almost all sides, a small basin in the southern area of the array. And here is our plan for the pollinator friendly installation. So this site is going to have 9 bee nesting boxes installed in the ground. And there's a detail for what that looks like here. It's a 3 by 3 foot space that is a mix of bare exposed soil and sand that's kept free of weeds and vegetation for the life of the project. We've got 4 seed mixes on this site because this site has some areas that are much wetter. So the areas in blue are our moist sun mix or our moist shade mix. And then the areas in purple are our upland shade mix, and we have our upland sun mix in yellow. And this is very site specific. Each mix and each area also has a very specific management strategy. So in this case, it's described briefly here in the map, but it's also described more at length in the plan. And sometimes, we go through multiple reviews with the people at UMass Clean Energy Extension before these plans are approved. So these projects are definitely above and beyond what you would find at a typical solar array in Massachusetts or in the United States. There's a detailed mowing plan, invasive species management plan, what to do if certain things are growing more than others, and so on, as well as the site establishment plan, how to actually get the seed mixes to take on the site. Here's an example of one of our seed mixes. This is our Upland Sun mix for this site. It's all native. As I mentioned, a third of the plants have to support either pollen specialist bees or Lepidoptera of conservation concern. So we've got things like yellow wild indigo, butterfly weed, broom sedge blue stem, little blue stem, black-eyed Susan, which serves as a great year one cover crop. All of these sites are also seeded along with a winter cover crop. They're usually installed in the fall. Purple lovegrass, spotted St. John's wort, slender bush clover, which is a nitrogen-fixing native clover, lobelia, penstemon, digitalis, mountain mint, and so on. Looking at our moist shade mix, this is for the areas that the wetter parts of the site. We have things like columbine, various native sedges, large-leaved wood aster, Eurybia macrophylla, cardinal flower, bladderpod lobelia. Again, black-eyed Susan is a great all-around flowering cover crop, zigzag goldenrod, early goldenrod, various asters, zizia, and so on. This here is the web soil survey that we do for each site. So we look, intimately on the ground doing the site survey, and then we also look at soils from above the ground, and that's part of what drives the plant selection. And right here on the right are just some images that we took showing that, as with all the pollinator-friendly sites, the fences have to be at least 6 to 12 inches off the ground at the bottom to allow wildlife passage. Again, these sites are not meant for sheep grazing, and putting sheep out on this site is really not doable if you're going for blooms throughout the season. Although you could, after the third growing season, potentially have sheep come in during the shoulder season to clear away cool season grasses. These here are some panoramas I shot of sites as they were being installed. I mean, it's really an ecological catastrophe. This is a clear cut. There's water, there's hydrology issues. Everything's being wiped away and taken off the site. So if they're going to be doing this anyway, the question I ask is, why not turn this into a native flowering meadow? I mean, the alternative is not very good. And another alternative that we have to solar in general is coal. And believe it or not, in 2021, US emissions rose by 6% compared to during the coronavirus pandemic in 2020. And during 2021, coal use in the US rose 17%, as well as sales of SUVs, which rose by 10%. So while coal is being phased out of use by over 40 countries globally, including the United Kingdom, in the US, we're actually increasing our use of coal. And that's really the question, the elephant that's in the room is, is it going to be coal, or is it going to be fracking, or is it going to be solar? I mean, we just don't really have that many options for large scale electricity generation. The way I like to think about this is, pollinators and insects in general are really tiny empires that run the world. And if there's anything that we can do to support them on these large scale energy projects, I think that's really important to consider. And I'll leave the rest of my time for questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Evan. And thank you, Jesse and Stephen as well. Those were very informative presentations, and we have a number of questions rolling in. So I will do my very best, folks, to get to all of them. I will get to the ones that were already in the chat, and then folks are also welcome to raise their hands and unmute. I think we have a reasonable enough number of people to do that. Okay, so one of the first questions that came in was for Jesse, and it was about the contracts. Are the grazing and management contracts earning hundreds per month or hundreds per year? I think there was
Per year.
per year.
So the way it typically works, and the contracts that I've done, are a season-long comprehensive vegetation management contract. So basically I'm saying you're not going to have to hire anybody to do any mowing or other vegetation management for the whole year. There are some folks who are doing a per grazing event basis contract. I prefer the season just because I don't know how much it's going to rain, and I want that flexibility. And from the solar asset owner's perspective, or the operations and maintenance manager's perspective, they like the fact that they won't incur the cost of a third mowing if they do have a rainy year. And so we just say, I'm going to take care of it for the whole season.
Got it. Okay. I also had a quick question about the bidding process. So when you say they put a bid out, as the owner of that array or the owner of the land who's putting out the bid?
No, pretend that the owner of the land doesn't own the land for the next 20 years. The asset owner controls the whole thing. The asset owner isn't always the person managing. There are often third-party O&M, operations and maintenance companies that actually manage the sites, run the sites. Sometimes there are multiple layers. There's one O&M company for the electronic components, a different O&M company for the vegetation and snow clearing and all of that kind of stuff. I'm not doing into the snow clearing stuff. I'm just doing growing season vegetation.
Awesome. Thank you for answering that. Evan, there was a question about, there are actually a number of questions about what you're doing. One is, are the pollinator habitats that you're installing, are they typically on all, degraded land? Are they on clear-cut forests? That kind of solar project? Are they on farmland? I think there's just sort of a question about, what type of, what type of land and solar installation you tend to be putting these on.
Yeah, that's a good question. I meant to address that. I had tried to get the data from the UMass Clean Energy Extension specifically regarding, for those 34 solar projects that were that have been certified, what the prior land use was. And then I thought, well, I could just look at my 28 plans and, give a pretty good roadmap. I would say, let me think real quick here. I would say, and this is totally rough, this is off the top of my head, I would say about 35 to 45% are clear-cut forests. Okay, let's say 40% are clear cuts. 25% are abandoned farmland, like literally, like the farmer has not been using it. And I know that because I farm my site and I can see when a land has been abandoned. I mean, when you start to see like, mugwort and multiflora rose that's like this high, that doesn't happen in 1 or 2 growing seasons. There are a small amount, actually it's really the minority, maybe like 5 to 10% that are croplands that look like they've been taken out of rotation like in the last year or 2. I can think of one site in Deerfield and a site in Whately. And then like the other like 40 or so percent are these sort of like scrubby, weedy, invasive ridden sites that like nobody has done anything with for like 10, 20 or more years, like places like Plymouth, Massachusetts. I'm thinking there was like a spot behind like a supermarket where it was like all invasives in like a forest with like knotweed, and like people had dumped their refrigerators. And then like there's sites that are like adjacent to a cranberry bog where it's just like all, catbrier and like multiflora rose and buckthorn and like, oriental bittersweet, like 30 feet, 40 feet up in the air. Those are easy sites to turn into solar. And I won't be shy about telling people that we recommend that our partners use herbicides during the first growing season to remove those invasives. I mean, they do what they can as far as scraping and grubbing and clearing. These sites are graded, machinery is going in, they're leveling it, but sometimes things grow back. And oftentimes to establish a perennial native grassland or meadow, you have to first really get rid of all of the invasives completely. And there's an example of a site in Westport, Massachusetts, which is it's in Bristol County, so it's near the bay. And so it was like a coastal forest. It was almost all native. They cleared it completely to do the array. And then for whatever reason, one of the contractors didn't do the installation correctly, and a lot of the panels were breaking. So they had to spend the whole first winter and spring and summer driving all around the site, repairing everything. And so they destroyed all the seed mixes that we had put down. and compacted all the soils. And then what ended up growing back was all of these like trees, and like the whole array is trees. It's like, I have pictures, there's like trees up to my shoulder last October in just one growing season. So it's really interesting because if you don't catch these sites at the right time, like right after they're cleared, whether they're cleared of grasses, cleared of invasives, or cleared of trees, you're really going to have like an uphill battle turning it even into like a viable field of like nothing, because things just start growing back. And in this case, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because the town of Westport did not allow the developer to use any herbicides, even just to clear in the beginning. And so now it's like they can't even get things to stop shading the panels because all these trees have grown in, and bushes and, you know, vines like our cap briars growing up the array, like around the racking. And so, I mean, then they can't scrape it out because all the conduits are in the ground. So it's interesting, you know, there's a lot of things that people don't think about when we talk about these things in broad terms. It's very difficult work to get these sites to establish.
Yeah, I think that maybe touches on a question that somebody else asked too about sort of how closely these sites end up being monitored for, you know, maintenance over time. So for example, if they're, you know, getting the sort of added credit for installing pollinator habitat, you know, you're obviously doing the initial installation and keeping an eye on it then, but is there a requirement that it's sort of checked in on over time? Or
yeah, I will put the link to the UMass Clean Energy Extension pollinator program into the chat, because if you read the certification criteria PDF and the application form, these sites are going to be monitored like 3 times per growing season per year, every year, starting with the 3rd growing season. So they give the developers like 3 seasons to establish the vegetation, because, you know, the first year you're planting the seeds, they're going to be like this big by the end of the season. Maybe you get some black-eyed Susan. That's usually about it. The 2nd growing season, they start to come in, but still they're really not that big. And you're doing a lot of mowing to sort of set back the cool season non-native grasses and weeds. It's really by the 3rd growing season that you start to see the actual native plant communities come in. And so they give them that period where there's no one coming and like giving them a hard time. But then starting that 3rd growing season, there's going to be botanists and ecologists from either UMass, or maybe they're going to subcontract a 3rd party. I don't know what their plan is, but independent verifiers are going to be coming in, and they're going to be checking these sites. These sites have to be, as a whole, like looking at the whole acreage within the fence, at least 50% native flowering plants. That's going to be like, you know, doing transects or sampling, randomized sampling. Beyond that, they have to have at least, I believe, 3 species blooming, creating flowers per season per year, which means at least 3 species blooming in the spring, at least 3 species blooming in the early summer, at least 3 species blooming in the late summer, and at 3 species blooming in the fall. So of those 4 mini seasons that are within our 6-month growing season, they're going to randomly show up in 3 out of 4 of them. And if they don't find at least 3 species in bloom, you're out. You're going to have to like submit a plan for addressing that, maybe buying more seeds, doing some sort of retrofitting. So I work really closely with all of my clients to ensure that our mixes are going to be going in hopefully closer to like 80 to 100% coverage. And we have like so many different species in our mixes. I mean, it's ridiculous. These are mixes with like 25 to 40 species. So we're covering all the seasons. I'm like really, you know, very proactive about that because I don't want to deal with a retrofit. And we use native seed, no-till seed drills to install. And, you know, it's like a lot of work, a lot of site work to install it.
someone was also asking about the seed mixes themselves and, you know, what you should purchase, but I mean, it sounds like the seed mixes that you're developing are rather tailored and you're doing it for, you know, maximum diversity. It's my impression that you can't just sort of buy those off the shelf, right? Oh, Evan, you're muted, sorry.
there's no generic seed mix that would be certifiable in Massachusetts. There are generic seed mixes that are, in my opinion, very poor, and that don't really support any known species at risk that you can buy from Ernst, but you'll never get certified in Massachusetts with that. I mean, those mixes are like majority non-native fescues. They're just not that good. And then when they do have flowers, it's like a lot of like the same sort of stuff, like, black-eyed Susan, maybe some mountain mint, maybe some, there's really, I mean, the thing is you're dealing with a couple of constraints. Number one, everything has to be mature height about 3 feet. If you're going to put in like a big blue stem or a switchgrass, forget it. You're going to shade your panels. I mean, the panels that Steven showed, that's not what these sites look like. These sites are like what Jesse talked about. Like the lower panel height is usually 3 feet off the ground. The higher height is like usually about 8, and you have a tight area underneath, and you've got to get it all established. So I've been asked on a few occasions if I could create like a sort of generic seed mix. And what I tell people is no, because I don't want people to be under the misguidance that they can just throw this down on any site. It's going to work. We have sites where even within the same array, we need multiple seed mixes, even in fully sunny areas.
Yeah, that's an important point. Lenore, I see you have your hand up, and I'm going to get to you in just a second. Just a related question, though, for Jesse. So you're talking about the solar panel height, right? And so it makes a lot of sense for the pollinator habitat to be, added on for those sites. But what makes a landowner or a company want to make a dual use site, which has to raise the solar panel pretty high up for something like grazing?
Yeah. So I want to be clear. So for most of the conversation, we talk about dual use. We're talking about in the SMART program adopted in 2018, there's the provision for an agricultural solar tariff generation unit, an ASTGU. What that is it's a dual use site that makes special modifications of the system to accommodate agricultural use. And it's eligible for an additional 6 cents per kilowatt hour incentive under the program. That's a different scenario from grazing sheep in a conventional solar array. So I can graze sheep I've seen very few, so I've been inside the fence on a couple dozen arrays at this point, and I've been outside the fence on several dozen arrays, looking at them, thinking about how do I use them. I've only seen a handful of arrays where the PV system, the panels and the racking, were a problem. The fences are problems. The the amount of roads and the land management, or how the land is prepared, and the seed mixes are problems. You can graze basically any halfway intelligent solar system. For the ASTGUs under the SMART program of the type that we're planning to build in Northfield, that's basically so that you can put cattle in there, so that you can grow crops in there, so that you can make hay in there. Those are the different set of goals, and it's a very specialized system.
Thank you for clarifying that. And Lenore, I know you've had your hand up, so feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, everybody. First, I want to thank you all, the presenters, for doing, this work and trying to figure out the best under this worst situation. But I have to just make this comment that I just refuse to accept their terms. And by their terms, I mean multinational corporations, a capitalist system that has created, even in this trying to deal with climate crisis, a smart subsidy program that really is not what we need. We need, as Evan was talking about, we need these connected, healthy ecosystems. We need viable farms. We need viable, intact forests. And even as we do all of this, I just hope that we're not kind of rolling over and accepting that, okay, well, this is the subsidies, this is the way it is, and so this is what we have to do. We can't. It's not enough to have energy renewables. I'm for solar, but we have to do it in a way that preserves our land and the integrity of the earth. And I feel like everyone who loves the land and loves the earth has to work with that also. So there's just these foregone conclusions and assumptions that it's so sad for me. As lovely as this research is and this work is, there's this sadness of this acceptance of like, well, since this is happening, we have to do it this way. And I just want to challenge that assumption amongst all of us who are humans who love the earth and love the land and want to do the best. For whatever that's worth, I will not give up on what I know needs to be done, which is ecosystem restoration and regeneration, and not just living with the way the state and the federal policy is dictating that we have to do this.
Can I mean, I don't know if Evan or Stephen, if you want to jump in, happy to, but can I just share my screen for a minute and just a little response? I hope I didn't sound like I was saying that we have these badly designed systems out there and how do we live with them? That's really not how I think about this. I'm thrilled to see the opportunities for grazing in the systems that have already been built that aren't dual use. And I'm crazy thrilled at the opportunity to do it in a really regenerative agricultural way. The system that we're looking at, and I didn't talk about this. I talked a little bit about the example of the orchard owner who put his land into solar and used that to do a reset, taking out a forest and putting it into meadow species. But the other thing that this is doing is it's allowing land transitions from one generation to another in situations where we don't have other good tools for it. So in Northfield, there's a generation that's in their 70s that wants to leave active farming and farm management. And there's an opportunity for a new farm manager to come in and take over management of some of the land. I'm thrilled at I don't own farmland. I've been farming for my entire career. This is for my family an opportunity to get onto more and better land than we otherwise have any chance to do. And so it's really a land transition project that also, it doesn't involve permanent conservation of that land. And that was a missed opportunity in the SMART program. There were some of us who were saying as part of this, dual use could, or for that matter, conversion of forest land projects could involve a land conservation component that's perpetual. But we couldn't get agreement within the conservation community and within the solar community around how to actually do that. But there is a 20-year commitment at the very least to, with a conventional array, keep it in that land use for 20 years. What that means in real life is the conservation community is going to have an opportunity to talk to the next landowner, not the current landowner. So where we didn't get a chance maybe this year with this landowner, they're willing to make a commitment and we get to talk to their heirs about permanent conservation on that. That's a huge thing. And Goldman Sachs or somebody else is paying for it. Like the whole conservation community, which can't do term easements or term restrictions in Massachusetts, and probably shouldn't, because it's not the best expenditure of money. If you could be doing conservation, permanent conservation with the same money, great. We just bought 20 years and had Wall Street pay the bill. Cool, I'm in. Like, I have no problem with that. It's not that I'm okay with it. It's great. That's a good outcome. When I look at the opportunity to do the same thing in Northfield, the 20-year requirement in Northfield isn't that it's gonna be here for 20 years. We have a conversation with a different landowner in 20 years. It's required to be in agricultural use for 20 years. That 6 cents a kilowatt hour is contingent on continuing to farm inside that system. The bank or the solar asset owner that ends up buying the system, they are going to take zero chance that they lose that 6 cents a kilowatt hour. They are going to make sure that that is farmed. What that means is there is capital available to ensure that the farm management transition works. Where else is that available? In the agricultural sector. They need it to work and they will make sure it works. When I look at Stephen's research, and let me back up and a huge shout out. I've been working in, with sheep since my time at Hampshire. My wife and I met at Hampshire. Leslie Cox, the farm manager at the time at Hampshire, they got us into farming and into thinking in an interdisciplinary way about all these things. So Leslie, Hampshire, they're behind, for me, a lot of my involvement in this kind of an interdisciplinary way. Dr. Herbert, his research got me really looking at, oh, wow, maybe we can go beyond sheep and into crops. So thank you, Stephen. It's great to see that happening at UMass. But what we're going to be able to do is start with sheep, start with forage, and then expand into cropping. And know that our land is secure for the rest of our working lifetimes, to know that there is, a permanent conservation, permanent APR is a commitment that's forward-looking. This is the same kind of commitment. And the thing that I think is amazing about those kind of forward-looking commitments is they're so rare in so much of what we do. We do a lot of backward, like organic certification is fundamentally a backward-looking thing. What did you do for the past 3 years? It's not a forward-looking commitment. It's most farmers who do it are very forward-looking and are making those forward commitments, but we haven't figured out in the marketplace how to make those forward-looking commitments. We don't have forward-looking certification programs. That's what dual use solar is. It is saying, I am gonna do this way for the next 20 years. And for me, looking at, we're running these panels in a north-south row that's tilting east-west. So in Dr. Herbert's presentation, he was talking about how the shade moves differently across the arrays, and they have sort of higher shade and lower shade areas in the arrays. I'm so glad that the UMass system was designed that way, because more than anything else, it taught us, orient the rows north-south. Then as the sun moves east-west across the field, we're going to have an even spread of shade. So you don't have plants that get more and less. The distribution of sunlight across our system is going to be, I don't have an actual number, but I would say an order of magnitude more even than what they had at the UMass system. I'm really, really glad that they built that system, found out, okay, here's the thing we can do differently. We're able to take advantage of that. We're going to have a much more consistent system in Northfield with very, very good productivity.
Could I
And I'm thrilled about it. This isn't like a second best solution. This is the best possible solution I can imagine. That's where I want to farm.
So there's some comments in the chat. I just want to make sure we have time to talk about them.
I'm sorry.
We have just so we're clear on time. We do need to end somewhat, maybe just like only a couple minutes over, because we have to free up this Zoom room for the next session. But Evan, I want to give you time to comment, and I have one last question for Dr. Herbert, actually.
So there's some comments in the chat, about the climate crisis and about how we're destroying all these farms and forests. I just want to remind people, if insect decline and biodiversity loss is not addressed, the climate crisis is not our only problem. We're not going to have any ecosystems on the planet, and we're not going to have food systems. And that's why I spent half of my talk talking about that, not talking about solar, because the fact that Massachusetts is the only state in the country that's paying enough money to these projects for them to be able to afford to buy the right seeds and spend the very expensive costs of preparing these sites for native ecological restoration, it should be commended. Any other state you look at in the country, they have pollinator-friendly scorecards. They are not comprehensive. They do not address species in decline. Again, what is biodiversity loss? It's species going extinct, species becoming extirpated. So we have to get that concept in our minds. If we don't help species that are in decline, we're not doing anything different. And that's why just putting honeybee hives on a field of clover is not going to solve anything. So unfortunately, Massachusetts happens to be the best example that we have to look at, because they actually give enough money back if people become pollinator friendly to make the pollinator friendly program possible. Now, yes, they're cutting forests down or maybe turning fields, but cropland, tilled cropland emits more carbon than 31 million cars per year in the United States. So I've looked at fields that I've gone to where they're growing GMO Roundup ready corn, and now it's a native pollinator meadow. And the same thing goes for all of these invasive species that are being cleared out a lot of these sites. I mean, not every site's perfect. Some are clear cuts, but at least 2/3 of them are not. And what we're putting into the ground is rebuilding native ecosystems. And we need to rebuild those native ecosystems across the state and across the world. So that's the point I'd like to make.
Thanks, Evan. I know there are additional comments about this, and I encourage everyone to sort of look through the chat and also to save the chat. So you can go to those, there are 3 little dots to the right of where you type in a chat. When you click on that, there's an option to save the chat, and it will download a text file to your computer so you can look through some of the comments that folks in the room have made today. And thank you everyone for offering your opinions and input. Before we go, I have another question for Dr. Herbert. You know, the conclusions from your research or that I interpreted from your slides is that you know, the crops do pretty well compared to the control, right? Under these hot and dry conditions. And I guess my question for you is, you know, in a changing climate in the future in Massachusetts or New England, does that kind of farming system make more sense, or is variability likely to be so high that it's hard to say sort of one way or the other, you know, just with regard to yield in particular?
Yeah, the yield of the crops in the dry yield was no better than the yield of the crops. This is under the solar panels in a wet year. They were roughly the same. So the amount of light coming in both years was probably similar, but the cooler conditions in the dry year under the panels was allowing those crops to yield as well as they did in a good year compared to the crops growing in full sun in a dry year. The idea that we may get into climate weirdness and more dry years, we just can't tell what is going to happen. I don't know what's going to be next year in terms of crop, or this year now, in terms of the rainfall patterns for farmers. And farmers are perplexed. We used to do things like, say, plant a cover crop by September 15 for erosion control. And then we did a lot of research showing that if you did it by September 1, you would not only do the erosion control, you'd save a lot of the nitrogen left over from the previous crop, which was leach over winter, because always nitrate levels were low in the spring. All of that has changed now. Our first frost used to come before September 15. Now, this last year, I don't know whether it came before end of October. So some of the things that we grew up with, understanding and farmers had, we don't have anymore. Another point I would make is that if I were looking at promoting this, I'm not sure I'd promote it for crops. Much easier to talk to farmers with cattle or sheep. And if they're up on poles like I had, or like Jesse showed, then we can also run the conduit over the top of the rail so it's not in the ground, and even goats won't get it. The only animal I would not probably put in there would be horses, because horses tend to rear up sometimes and might damage themselves if they were there. Another point I'd make is I've contemplated the solar industry. There's work out of Germany that said that you can't get above about 20% of your energy coming from solar panels. That is because at night, as the sun goes down, all your solar energy goes away. And they found if they were above 20% in the gear up for electricity supply to households, which are now getting ready for dinner and other things and watching TV and all that, it was costing them just as much in fossil fuels to gear up as it was if they didn't have the solar panels. So we've got to be real on what we can do. I have a graphic which shows, yeah, we can put solar panels out to replace all of the energy in the US, in Massachusetts, with about under 2% of the land area. but we could never do that because we couldn't integrate that into the system unless we get much better batteries to use some of that solar energy and store it for when we really need it. So those are some of the perspectives. I would use cattle, sheep, or goats under solar panels to graze it before I'd go growing crops.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you for that perspective and that information. Well, it is 10:35. I want to respect everyone's time. Thank you so much to our presenters, Evan, Stephen, Jesse. Thank you so much for presenting, and thank you everyone who came to this session. And there's obviously a rich conversation to be had, and I hope it continues beyond today. All right.
Rosemary, I
Yes,
want to point out a couple of questions. For the presenters, if you're willing to share your email, if people have further questions, can you drop that into the links? And also people have asked about whether or not your presentations are available for download. So if you could pop something in there now, if you're open to that, and then if people want your PowerPoint, they can get in touch with you. That would be helpful. And again, if you want to save the chat, those 3 buttons will tell you how to save the chat. The 3 buttons on the chat spot.
Excellent. Thank you, Fern. And we dropped the evaluation link, so please fill that out. Check out our vendor marketplace, the auction, and of course, there are many other sessions during our conference, so head back to the program book. Thank you, everyone. Happy conferencing.
Okay, bye.
Bye.